Picture the heaviest, strongest soldier you can imagine, head to toe in steel, a wall of armor on a warhorse. Now put him on a frozen lake. For most of history, that knight was the most powerful weapon on any battlefield, almost unstoppable. But on the 5th of April, 1242, an army of them rode out onto a sheet of ice, and by the end of that day, that strength had become the very thing that destroyed them. The most famous version of this story says the ice cracked, and the knights sank screaming into freezing water. It is one of the most dramatic images in all of medieval history, and most of it, it turns out, is not actually true. To understand what really happened, we have to go to a cold frontier in the year 1242. This was the edge of the known world, where two very different powers were about to collide. From the west came the Crusaders, chief among them an order of German warrior monks. They were knights who had taken holy vows, sworn to fight and to spread their faith by the sword. They wore heavy plate and mail, rode armored horses, and were feared across Europe. Their goal was to push east into the lands of Novgorod, a rich Russian city-state. They had already seized towns. They wanted more land and more souls converted to their church. Standing against them was a young Russian prince named Alexander. He was barely into his 20s, and the survival of his homeland now rested on him. But here is the problem Alexander faced, and it seemed almost impossible to solve. The Crusader knights were simply better armed than anything he had. A charge of heavy cavalry was like a battering ram of steel and muscle. It could smash straight through a line of ordinary foot soldiers and scatter them like leaves. Alexander's army was smaller in armor and full of lightly equipped militia and archers. In a head-on clash on open ground, he would almost certainly lose. So he could not fight the battle the knights wanted. He had to choose a battlefield that would turn their greatest strength into a deadly weakness. He had one advantage the knights did not respect. He knew this frozen ground far better than they did, and the battlefield he chose was the ice. Lake Peipus was a vast frozen lake on the border between his lands and the Crusaders. In early April, the surface was still locked in the ice of a long northern winter. Alexander positioned his army with its back to the shore on and beside the frozen lake. Now think about what ice does to a heavily armored man. On solid ground, that armor is protection. On ice, it becomes a trap. The knight and his horse together could weigh 1/3 of a ton. All of that weight pressing down through iron horseshoes onto a slick frozen surface. They could not turn quickly, they could not stop, they could barely keep their footing. Alexander's lighter troops, by contrast, could move far more freely across the same ice. He did not need better armor than the knights. He needed the knights to charge and to overcommit out onto that treacherous surface, and he knew exactly how to make them do it, because the Crusaders had a signature move, a favorite formation. And Alexander was about to use their own tactic against them. The knights liked to attack in a tight wedge, a great arrowhead of armored cavalry. The Germans called it the boar's head, a spear point of iron aimed at the enemy's heart. It was designed to punch a hole straight through the middle of an opposing army, and on that April morning they formed up and aimed it directly at the center of Alexander's line. What they did not know was that the center was a trap. As the battle began, Russian archers sent volleys of arrows into the advancing knights. But the wedge kept coming, and it smashed into Alexander's center with a sound like thunder. And exactly as the Crusaders hoped, the Russian middle began to give way. The lightly armed militia in the center fell back under the crushing charge. To the knights, it must have looked like victory. The enemy line was breaking, so they pushed harder, driving deeper, chasing the retreating Russians further onto the lake. But this was not a rout. It was bait. Alexander had deliberately made his center weak and packed his real strength on the wings. The knights, buried in their own wedge, had charged straight into a closing pocket. And now, at Alexander's signal, the trap sprang shut. His strong flanks swept inward from both sides, wrapping around the Crusader wedge. The knights, who relied on the momentum of a straight charge, were suddenly surrounded. Out on the open ice, they could not wheel their heavy horses to face the new threat. They were packed together, unable to maneuver, hemmed in on every side. Their greatest weapon, the unstoppable charge, was now completely useless. The lighter Russian soldiers swarmed in among them. They dragged knights down from their horses onto the ice, and the proud spearhead of the crusader army began to collapse into chaos. And it is right here that the legend takes over from the history, because this is the moment everyone thinks they know. The moment the ice itself is said to have opened up and swallowed the knights whole. It is a breathtaking image. It is in the paintings, the films, the school books. In 2 minutes, I'll show you how much of it really happened and where the myth came from. The honest answer is less cinematic than the legend, but far more clever. First, what the oldest records actually say. The earliest Russian account of the battle is surprisingly short. It describes a great slaughter of the crusaders on the ice and a long pursuit across the lake. It says the Russians chased the fleeing enemy for miles over the frozen surface. It mentions hundreds of the enemy killed and dozens captured and led away. But the earliest, closest sources say very little about the ice breaking at all. The vivid image of knights plunging through the ice comes mostly from much later retellings, and above all, from one single, enormously powerful source. In 1938, a Soviet filmmaker named Sergei Eisenstein made a film called Alexander Nevsky. It was made as patriotic cinema at a time when Germany again threatened Russia's borders. And in that film, in unforgettable scenes, the ice shatters beneath the German knights. They sink, thrashing into the black freezing water, dragged down by their own armor. It is stunning filmmaking. It is also largely invented. That film seared the image into the world's memory as if it were simple fact. Most historians today believe the ice was not the real killer. Some ice may well have cracked near the shore under all that weight late in the fighting. A number of knights may have fallen through in the chaos of the retreat, but it was not a great sheet splitting open and swallowing an army whole. The knights were not defeated by the lake. They were defeated by the plan, by being lured in, surrounded, pulled from their horses, and cut down on the ice. The drowning is the part we remember. The trap is the part that actually won. And in a way, the truth is more impressive than the myth, because it means the victory was not a lucky accident of cracking ice. It was the result of a young commander who understood his enemy perfectly, who turned their armor, their horses, and their favorite tactic into a death trap. The ice did not beat the knights, Alexander did. Remember that the next time a single dramatic scene stands in for an entire war, but the story of the sinking knights was simply too good to let go of. If you are enjoying separating this myth from the history, take a second to hit like. It really helps. And that raises a question that is bigger than one battle on one frozen lake. Why do we remember the dramatic lie so much more easily than the clever truth? Why does the image of sinking knights stick while the brilliant trap fades? The answer says something uncomfortable about all of us. A cracking lake and drowning men is a simple, vivid, emotional picture. It has a clear villain, a dramatic death, and a satisfying sense of justice. A carefully planned double envelopment of cavalry is, by comparison, harder to picture. Our minds hold on to the image and quietly let the strategy slip away. And this is not just about one medieval battle. It is how a huge amount of history reaches us, not as it truly happened, but as the most dramatic version someone later told. A film, a painting, a stirring story can overwrite the facts entirely, and once that vivid image is planted, it is almost impossible to remove. You have almost certainly remembered things that never actually happened this way. Not because you are foolish, but because a powerful story is stronger than a dry fact. The battle on the ice is famous for the one thing that mostly did not happen, and nearly forgotten for the thing that actually did. That is worth sitting with. The past you picture is not a recording. It is a collection of the best stories that survived. Some true, some exaggerated, and some simply invented by a brilliant filmmaker. So what did the battle actually change once we set the legend aside? The defeat was a genuine catastrophe for the Crusaders. They were forced to give up their claims on Novgorod and pull back from those lands. Their long push east into Russian territory was effectively stopped. A boundary settled into place between the Western and Eastern Christian worlds. a line whose echoes you can still trace on a map today. And this is where a battle from 1242 quietly reaches into your own mind, because the way you remember this battle is the way you remember almost everything. Think of the historical events you feel you know well. How many of them do you know from real records, and how many from a movie? The charging music, the dramatic slow motion, the perfect final line. These are the things that stick, not the messy, complicated truth. Your sense of the past is built in large part by storytellers, by people choosing which moments to make vivid and which to leave out. That is not a reason to distrust all history, but it is a reason to stay a little humble about what you think you know. The next time a historical scene feels cinematic and perfect, pause for a second. Ask yourself where that image actually came from: a chronicle or a film, a document or a painting. Because the most powerful battles are not always fought with swords. Some are fought over how a story will be remembered. The sword decides the day, the story decides the century. And those battles can be won centuries after the fighting stops. Alexander won on the ice, but the myth won everywhere else. We like to think we remember the past as it was, that history is a solid record we can simply look back on. But history is far more fragile and far more human than that. It survives in stories, and stories change with every telling. The dry truth is delicate. The dramatic image is almost immortal. A single film can outweigh a shelf of careful scholarship. And a clever young prince can win a battle twice, once on the ice and once forever in the way we imagine it. So go back to that knight from the very beginning, head to toe in steel, the strongest soldier on any battlefield. Now you know what really happened when he rode out onto that frozen lake. He was not simply swallowed by cracking ice. That is the story we were given. He was outsmarted, lured forward, surrounded, and pulled down by a lighter, cleverer foe. His armor did not save him, it trapped him. His charge did not break the line, it doomed him. The lake was just the stage. The real weapon was a plan. And the reason you picture drowning knights and not a brilliant trap is that 100 years ago, someone told the story that way and told it beautifully. That is how powerful a single image can be. The battle on the ice is a perfect little lesson hiding inside a medieval war story. It teaches us how victories are actually won, not always by strength, but by understanding. Alexander did not have the better army. He had the better idea. He looked at everything that made the knights strong and found the place it made them weak. Heavy armor on thin ice, an unstoppable charge lured into a closing trap. That is a kind of genius that has nothing to do with muscle. But the battle teaches us a second lesson too, and it is about ourselves, about how easily a good story can replace the truth in our heads, about how the most cinematic version of an event becomes the one we all believe. The knights sinking through the ice never really happened on the scale we imagine, and yet all of us can picture it in vivid detail right now. That is the strange power of a story told well. It can take a small, brutal, clever battle on a frozen frontier and turn it into a legend that outlives every person who was there. We remember Alexander as a hero, and that part is fair. He earned it. But we remember the ice for something it mostly did not do. And both of those memories were shaped long after by people with a story to tell. So the next time you feel certain about how some famous event unfolded, gently ask yourself how you actually know it. Records fade and paintings crack, but a well-told scene can outlast them all. Did you read the records or did you see the movie? There is no shame in the answer. We all live inside stories.